You must see these shocking historical photos. Write in the comments, which photo did you like the most? In 1993, Tommaso Buscetta testified against Toto Riina, the boss of bosses, while 4 policemen formed a protective line around him. Buscetta knew Cosa Nostra from the inside, and his testimony helped turn its hidden command system into court evidence. In 1992, police used water jets at India Gate as people gathered to remember those lost in the 1984 anti-Sikh unrest. The scene was especially tense because India Gate is a national memorial, yet this day turned it into a place of crowd control. In November 1868, rescued East African captives sat aboard the Royal Navy ship Daphne after a patrol stopped their transport at sea. Daphne searched the Indian Ocean for trafficking vessels, and this rare photograph preserves the faces behind official rescue numbers. Paula Hitler was Adolf Hitler's younger sister, but she never joined the Nazi Party and lived far from his inner circle. After the war, she used the name Paula Wolf and spent her final years quietly in Berchtesgaden as his last surviving close relative. This is the damaged garage of Hotel Evropa in Sarajevo, photographed in 1914, one day after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot nearby. Anti-Serb riots then spread through the city, turning a local political attack into one of the first visible shocks before the First World War. In June 1995, television anchor Jody Huisentruit called her producer to say she had overslept and was leaving for work. Minutes later, she disappeared from her parking lot with a bent car key and her shoes left beside her car. This unfinished obelisk still lies in the Aswan granite quarry, where Egyptian workers carved it from one piece of stone around 1500 before the Common Era. At about 42 meters long and over 1,200 tons, it would have been the largest Egyptian obelisk ever raised, but cracks stopped the project. Neptune Pool at Hearst Castle began in 1924 and was built as a private Roman-style showpiece in the California hills. It holds about 345,000 gallons of water, with marble statues, temple fronts, and colonnades made to look older than America itself. Jack Earl, born Jacob Ehrlich, became a silent film actor and sideshow performer after a childhood pituitary condition made him over 7 feet 6 inches tall. In El Paso, people called him Pecos Bill, and he later sold candy across America while writing poems and painting. On January 11, 1942, Japanese soldiers moved past the Sultan Abdul Samad building as Kuala Lumpur came under wartime occupation. Its copper spires had been removed before the war to make the landmark less visible from the air, while smoke rose from the nearby General Post Office. These Dutch men are wearing traditional Volendam work trousers, the wide black pants once common among fishermen and farmers. Their heavy clothing was built for daily labor, not display, which is why the outfit looks so unusual in a studio-like photograph today. In May 2008, Rachel Hoffman lost her life during a failed undercover operation that raised serious questions about police use of vulnerable informants. 1 year later, Rachel's law forced Florida officers to check risks, give clear terms, and receive special training before using people in these operations. In 1859, San Francisco resident Joshua Norton declared himself Emperor of the United States and began signing public orders as Norton I. Local businesses accepted his personal currency, newspapers printed his decrees, and the city turned his impossible title into a beloved civic legend. In Esteli, Nicaragua, in 1979, Susan Meiselas photographed Sandinista member Pablo Arauz outside the National Guard headquarters. The raised Pepsi bottle became one of the most famous images of the revolution, turning one street moment into a symbol of a collapsing regime. In the 1890s, Cairo photo studios let tourists place their faces inside Egyptian-style sarcophagus and sphinx props. The top sitter is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, decades before his final visit to Sarajevo helped set off the First World War. The Hughes XF-11 was a huge twin-boom spy plane built in the 1940s for the United States Army Air Forces. Howard Hughes flew the first test himself, and the aircraft became famous when that flight ended in a dramatic failure over Beverly Hills. The 1971 Stanford prison experiment became famous because students quickly changed their behavior inside a fake prison run by researcher Philip Zimbardo. Later recordings suggested some harsh actions were encouraged, making the deepest question how the scientist became part of the system he claimed to study. This photo shows a man standing beside a giant mounted polar bear, making the animal's size look almost unreal. The Spitfire test description does not match the image, so this one needs the correct historical context before publishing. In this Luftwaffe ground test, one 30mm cannon round was used on a Spitfire to study how much its rear section could take. The tail section separated almost completely, showing why large cannon rounds became so feared in late Second World War air combat. This rare Dufay color image shows a London street on December 15, 1943, after an air raid left rows of homes broken open. The color makes the scene feel unusually close because wartime Britain is usually remembered in black and white. In 1863, 19 members of the Brighton Swimming Club posed in top hats and striped bathing trunks on the English coast. The formal hats make the scene look strange today, but sea swimming was already becoming a serious public sport in Victorian Britain. In 1974, Israeli soldiers carried students out during the Ma'alat school hostage crisis in northern Israel. The attackers had crossed from Lebanon, and the event forced Israel to rethink how schools and youth trips were protected. On March 9, 1993, a National Aeronautics and Space Administration SR-71 Blackbird climbed from Dryden with its afterburners glowing in the dusk. This aircraft could fly above most weather and faster than 3 times the speed of sound, making it look almost unreal in flight. In 1939, Soviet troops questioned Japanese prisoners after the Battle of Khalkhin Gol on the border of Mongolia and Manchuria. The Soviet victory stayed little known in the West, yet it helped push Japan away from a northern campaign and toward the Pacific. Frank Mattler, known as Barney Baldwin, was an American sideshow performer who wore a brace after a reported neck injury. His calm studio portrait hides a chaotic life of public performances, changing names, troubled marriages, and newspaper scandals. This lavish dinner at George Remus's Price Hill home shows how a Prohibition bootlegger lived like royalty in 1920s Cincinnati. His wife Imogene stands nearby, and by 1927 their marriage had become the center of a national courtroom scandal. In about 1955, Liberace posed with a fan club member while boarding an American Airlines flight to Paris, dressed in the polished showman style that made him instantly recognizable. The sign jokingly warned him not to fall for French women, capturing how his fans treated every public trip like part of the performance. On October 20, 1945, French crews flew Handley Page Halifax aircraft low over the Garonne River near Bordeaux on their final return home. After years serving with the Royal Air Force, the formation turned a military aircraft into a symbol of France coming back from occupation. In the summer of 1856, Warsaw photographer Marcin Olszyński captured Marek Ptaszyński, a 41-year-old villager from Ptaki in Poland. The close portrait is rare because ordinary rural workers were almost never photographed this directly in the early days of photography. Around 1980, technicians stood on the reactor lid of Unit 2 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, years before the site became known worldwide. Each numbered square marked a reactor channel, making the floor beneath them look like a giant control map of the machine. In 1968, Prague crowds gathered around Soviet-led tanks near Czechoslovak radio, one of the last uncensored voices of the Prague Spring. People climbed onto the vehicles with a national flag, turning a military street scene into a public fight for free speech. In 1942, Slovak Jewish woman Helena Citronova was sent to Auschwitz, where her singing at a birthday event drew the attention of Officer Franz Wunsch. His protection later helped Helena and her sister survive, turning this photo into one of the strangest moral stories from the camp system. On September 25, 1980, Iraqi servicemen returned to Basra only days after the Iran-Iraq War began. The portrait on the bus makes the scene more telling, linking ordinary troops to Saddam Hussein's new campaign at the very start. In November 1965, a football game between Northfield Mount Hermon and Deerfield Academy continued while Silliman Hall burned behind the crowd. Robert S. Van Fleet captured one frame where a school match, spectators, firefighters, and a science-building emergency all happened at once. In 1968, Don McCullen photographed a United States Marine during the Battle of Hue, one of the hardest urban battles of the Vietnam War. His stare became famous because it showed the human cost of street fighting without needing to show the battle itself. In June 1956, people in Poznan ran through Dąbrowskiego Street during one of the first major worker uprisings in Soviet-controlled Poland. The protest began over wages and conditions, but it quickly became a public challenge to the entire communist system. After the war, Joachim Peiper, a former Nazi officer convicted for wartime crimes, lived quietly in Treves, France, until graffiti marked his street in 1976. That July, his house was set on fire, and the case ended with an unidentified death and a mystery that was never fully solved. In 1918, an American soldier in San Diego used his protective mask for a very different job: peeling onions. The same equipment made for dangerous fumes also stopped kitchen tears, turning a serious wartime tool into a strange, everyday trick. On August 8, 1991, the cargo ship Vlora arrived in Bari after thousands of Albanians climbed aboard in Durrës and crossed the Adriatic. The packed ship became one of the most striking images of Albania's sudden opening after decades of isolation. In June 1944, Peter Stackpole photographed United States Marines holding a hilltop position during the Battle of Saipan. The island was a key step toward Japan, and this quiet view shows how close, hidden, and exhausting Pacific combat could be. In 1918, this photograph showed the royal elephant stables of Hampi, once part of the powerful Vijayanagara Empire in southern India. Built in the 15th century, the long domed structure housed royal elephants used in ceremonies and battle, then survived for centuries after the imperial city was abandoned. In 1971, protesters in Helsinki carried small white coffins against Finland's new pregnancy law, which allowed the procedure for serious social or economic reasons. The march shows how quickly a legal change became a public moral battle, with children's coffins used as the strongest possible symbol. Around 1984, Vitaly Karpov photographed a young couple with a bicycle and a dog in Crimea, then part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The scene feels simple, but the clothes, bicycle, and quiet street show everyday Soviet youth far from official parades and propaganda. In August 1940, Royal Air Force pilots sprinted toward their Spitfires during the Battle of Britain as fighter stations like Biggin Hill faced constant air raids. They often had only minutes to take off, climb, and meet incoming aircraft before their own runways became unsafe. In 1936, the Hindenburg Passenger Lounge looked like a flying hotel, but every chair, wall panel, and table had to be made as light as possible. The strangest detail was a sealed smoking room with one electric lighter inside a hydrogen airship that the world would soon remember for its final flight. In 1950, children in Seoul ran around a United States soldier after United Nations forces entered the city again during the Korean War. Their smiles hide the scale of the moment because Seoul changed hands more than once in the first year of the war. Dr. Elizabeth Broyne worked as an ambulance surgeon in New York City when emergency care still moved by horse-drawn carriage. On her first day in 1910, she saved a baby after a gas leak in an apartment, turning this quiet ambulance photo into a record of early modern rescue work. On April 8, 1945, the B-17 flying fortress called Wee Willie broke apart over Germany during its 128th mission. Only one crewman survived to be taken prisoner, making this blurred sky photograph one of the final records of the aircraft. In 1908, miners stood beside the wooden support frames deep inside the Homestake mine in Lead, South Dakota. Those huge beams held back the rock above them, showing how the mine became one of America's longest-running gold operations. On April 11, 1914, industrial workers of the world member Ian Turner stood in Union Square with a hat reading "Bread or Revolution." The message captured the pressure of the era, when jobless workers used public rallies to demand food, wages, and dignity in the heart of New York City. At Woodstock in 1969, a handwritten sign offered acid for $1 beside barefoot festival goers resting on the grass. The photo captures how openly psychedelic culture, music, and youth rebellion mixed at one of America's most famous festivals. In October 1941, Ukrainian nationalist riders paraded in Stanislav during the visit of Hans Frank, the top German official in occupied Poland. The image is striking because local ceremony, imperial uniforms, and occupation symbols appear together only months after the region changed hands. In 1912, a Titanic survivor was helped down a gangway after reaching safety with heavily bandaged feet. The image shows the hidden aftermath of the sinking, when rescue did not end the pain carried by those who made it back. In 1940, a Spanish-American farm family posed inside their home in Chamizal, New Mexico, with 4 young children gathered around one chair. The worn floor, work clothes, and small room show rural family life in the American Southwest far more clearly than any official report. Around 1991, Rob Riggle was photographed in United States Marine Corps uniform, years before most people knew him from comedy and television. He later served for more than 2 decades, making this casual shipboard photo a rare look at the military life behind his public career. In 1917, cadets loyal to the provisional government held positions near the Moscow Kremlin as Bolshevik forces moved to take control of the city. The photo captures a brief and tense moment when Russia's old order had fallen, but the new one was still being decided street by street. In 1946, Abby Stockton and Relna McRae lifted together at Santa Monica's Muscle Beach, where public strength shows drew large crowds. Stockton helped make women's weight training visible at a time when many people still thought heavy lifting was only for men. In 1972, basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar filmed with Bruce Lee for Game of Death, creating one of the most unusual size contrasts in cinema history. Abdul-Jabbar stood about 7 feet 2 inches tall, while Lee used speed, timing, and movement to make the scene feel believable. In 1977, Budapest painting students at State Construction Company No. 43 practiced ladder safety in a courtyard like a line of recruits. The ordinary trade lesson looks almost unreal, showing how even basic construction training in socialist Hungary was organized with strict group discipline. On March 28, 1994, South African police took cover near Shell House in Johannesburg as political tensions spilled into the street. The scene came just weeks before South Africa's first democratic election, when the country was still moving from apartheid into an uncertain new era. This staged image shows Maori men reenacting close combat during the New Zealand colonial conflicts, sometime between 1865 and 1872. The scene is unusual because it shows an internal Maori divide, with some groups backing the colonial government and others resisting its expansion. At the 1980 Moscow Olympics, Polish pole vaulter Władysław Kozakiewicz won gold and set a world record in front of a hostile Soviet crowd. His arm gesture became famous in Poland as a symbol of defiance, just weeks before solidarity changed the country's politics. In September 1941, Ukrainian collective farm workers dug anti-tank trenches as the German advance pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Many were ordinary civilians with farm tools, turning fields into defensive lines before the front reached them. On April 26, 1937, German and Italian aircraft left Guernica in ruins during the Spanish Civil War. The shattered Basque town shocked Europe and inspired Pablo Picasso's Guernica, one of the most famous anti-war paintings ever made. In 1998, 10-year-old Natasha Kampusch vanished in Austria, and her case stayed unsolved for 8 years. In 2006, she escaped from a hidden room and spoke her own name at a neighbor's door, ending one of Europe's most haunting missing person cases. In 1979, Pol Pot led Khmer Rouge fighters through the Cambodian jungle after losing Phnom Penh to Vietnamese-backed forces. The image shows the movement shifting from ruling Cambodia to hiding in border forests, where it stayed active for years. In July 1908, Vietnamese resistance fighters were held inside Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi after a failed plot against French colonial rule. The wooden restraints show how early anti-colonial movements were punished decades before the prison became known worldwide as the Hanoi Hilton. In 1958, Marilyn Monroe posed for a polio vaccination campaign as America pushed families to protect children before summer play. The poster used Hollywood glamour for public health, turning a serious medical message into something millions would actually notice. In 1944, Allied artillery lit the mountains of the Italian front during a night operation. The glowing arcs show how soldiers fought through steep terrain, where darkness, weather, and distance made every position hard to reach. In 1945, Tokyo residents and police stood on rice bales saved from a damaged warehouse in the Toshima district. The photo shows the war through food, not weapons, as every rescued sack meant survival in a city under extreme pressure. In October 1922, Italian blackshirts marched through the streets during the crisis that brought Benito Mussolini to power. Their wet uniforms and military formation show how a street movement turned public pressure into a new political order. In 1942, Wolfgang Suschitzky photographed St. Paul's Cathedral through a broken London window during the Second World War. The shattered frame made the dome look even stronger, turning damage and survival into one unforgettable image. On July 10, 1932, 1,465 delegates filled Berlin for the Anti-Fascist Congress of the United Front. The hall shows Germany's street politics before Weimar democracy fell, when rival movements competed for crowds, banners, and power. In 1940, Finnish border patrol dogs waited in a long line for dinner outside a rural post. These were working animals used for patrols and messages during a year when Finland's border became one of Europe's tensest lines. In 1944, an Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed Auschwitz-Birkenau from above, turning a guarded place into roads, smoke, buildings, and rail lines on film. The image is haunting because it shows how one of history's most hidden systems could appear from the sky as a cold map of squares and shadows. During the Mexican Revolution, women known as soldaderas rode with armies and worked as fighters, couriers, nurses, and supply organizers. Some even reached officer status, making this image a rare look at women who were not just following history, but helping move it forward. In June 1989, people moved through a Beijing avenue after the Tiananmen Square protests were forcefully ended. Burned vehicles, bicycles, and wet pavement show how quickly an ordinary city road became a record of national shock. Around 1900 and around 2000, the same family farmhouse was photographed after more than a century of change. The small upper window belonged to 3 generations, making one room a quiet link between childhood, parents, and grandparents. During the Spanish Civil War, a young Republican woman posed with a rifle, showing how the conflict pulled women into roles far beyond the home. For a short moment in the 1930s, female militia members became a visible symbol of revolution before most were pushed away from the front. In 1943, A young Leonid Brezhnev was photographed in a hospital after being injured during the Second World War. He served as a political officer on the Southern Front and ended the war as a major general, decades before becoming the Soviet Union's leader. On August 29, 1944, soldiers of Pennsylvania's 28th Infantry Division marched down the Champs-Élysées 4 days after Paris was liberated. With the Arc de Triomphe behind them, the parade showed the world that the city was back in Allied hands. On May 31, 1889, the John Schultz House was torn from its foundation during the Johnstown flood and carried away with debris. A tree punched through the building as it moved, yet all 6 people inside survived one of America's most destructive flood disasters. In 1949, floodwater filled Kursavoy Lane near Kropotkinskaya in Moscow, leaving a car half buried in the street. The man posing beside it makes the scene look almost casual, but the water level shows how suddenly city life could stop. In 1910, a blind Ukrainian learnik in the Poltava region played a hand-cranked lira while a young guide boy stayed beside him. These traveling musicians carried old songs, prayers, and village news, often earning food or coins one small crowd at a time. In Soviet Tajikistan in the 1970s, a groom filled out marriage registration papers while the bride sat beside him under a traditional veil. The photo captures one quiet meeting point between state paperwork and old wedding customs in Central Asia. In 1944, Soviet worker Ivan Olenek was photographed in Cologne with an identification board during forced labor at a German chemical factory. His tired face and numbered slate show how millions of civilians were turned into tracked labor far from home during the Second World War. In 1941, members of a Soviet Special Motorized Rifle Brigade practiced close fighting techniques during emergency wartime training. The unit trained selected volunteers for high-risk missions, so even this simple exercise was part of preparing men for work far behind the front. These performers were billed as the Carlson Sisters, a vintage novelty act that presented women's boxing as staged entertainment rather than serious sport. The gloves, costumes, and posed smiles show how early show business turned appearance and playful competition into a ticket-selling spectacle. In the 1880s, this photograph from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, shows colonial hunters posing beside an elephant after a big game expedition. The image is a stark record of an era when powerful animals were treated as trophies, not protected wildlife. Marlene Dietrich swept the floor at the Hollywood Canteen, where servicemen in uniform received free food, music, and a few hours away from war. Opened in October 1942, the club turned film stars into waiters, cooks, cleaners, and performers for United States and Allied troops. On August 15, 1945, Tokyo residents listened as Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in the Second World War. For many people, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice, and the moment marked the sudden end of Imperial Japan. In ruined Berlin, a civilian stood beside an abandoned German 21-centimeter Morser, 18 heavy howitzer left in the street. The giant weapon now looked powerless against the broken buildings around it, turning one corner of the city into a quiet symbol of defeat. In 1960, a major fire in Moscow filled a narrow street with smoke as crowds watched firefighters climb ladders toward the upper floors. The scene shows how dangerous city emergencies looked before modern safety systems, with people, trucks, and rescue crews packed into the same dark street. On May 25, 1917, the Red Cross collected donations outside the New York Public Library using a vacuum cleaner hose. The strange setup turned loose coins from the crowd into a public spectacle, making wartime fundraising impossible to ignore. On January 22, 1945, German Volkssturm Home Guard prisoners stood in Insterburg, East Prussia, after the city was taken by the Soviet 11th Guards Army. Their worn coats and mixed civilian gear show the last emergency mobilization of older men and untrained locals as Germany's Eastern Front collapsed. In 1959, a 13-year-old girl in Los Angeles was photographed by police after taking her parents' car without permission. The quiet face in this record later belonged to one of America's most recognizable singers, making the image feel almost impossible at first glance. In early 20th century France, soldiers of the 31st Line Regiment practiced fencing drills on a narrow raised beam in Melun. The exercise trained balance, nerve, and weapon control, turning a military lesson into a public postcard spectacle. In February 1945, United States forces used truck-mounted rocket launchers on Iwo Jima to support the advance across the volcanic island. The smoke and steep ground show why the battle was so difficult, with every hidden position needing to be reached from very close range. On July 15, 1966, a United States Marine Corps Sea Knight helicopter trailed smoke over Vietnam while troops moved below. The image captures how helicopter crews worked dangerously close to the ground, carrying men through jungle zones where every landing could turn into a crisis. On November 20, 1944, the United States Navy oiler Mississinawa burned at Ulithi Atoll after being struck by a Japanese chiton torpedo. The towering smoke column shows how one hit on a fuel ship could turn a quiet anchorage into a massive naval emergency within minutes. In 1949, this Berlin flak tower was photographed after demolition blasts finally cracked its massive concrete walls. Built to resist air raids, the tower survived the war so stubbornly that removing it became a post-war engineering problem. At Gallipoli during the First World War, Ottoman Corporal Sayet Ali Kabuk carried a huge artillery shell by hand after the loading crane stopped working. The act became one of Turkey's most famous wartime legends, turning one soldier's strength into a national symbol of resistance. In the 1980s, a Belgian foreign fighter stood with Karen soldiers in Burma during their long struggle for autonomy. The photo points to a little-known conflict where local forces also drew outsiders into the mountains and borderlands of Southeast Asia. This is a scene from the 1969 film Battle of Britain, made to recreate the air war over Britain with real aircraft and large practical sequences. The movie became famous because many flying scenes were staged with actual vintage planes, making its sky battles look unusually real. In 1969, 50,000 plastic mannequins filled Rome's Olympic Stadium as fake spectators for the film The Games. The empty crowd looked massive on camera, turning a silent army of figures into one of cinema's strangest Olympic illusions. A Japanese Type 99 Kai 3 model, 3-phosphorus anti-aircraft device bursts above a United States B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. Imperial Japanese Navy interceptors released these weapons from above, trying to damage bomber formations without closing into direct gunfire. On March 10, 1945, American B-29 bombers burned vast sections of Tokyo in the most destructive air raid of the Second World War. This aerial view looks almost unreal because whole neighborhoods were erased in a single night, and the attack took more lives than many major battles. In 1965, Londoners climbed onto the roof of a war-damaged building to watch Winston Churchill's funeral procession pass below. The scene is powerful because people were saying goodbye to Britain's wartime leader from the ruins left by the war he had helped them survive. In October 1973, Israeli soldiers called their families after the Yom Kippur War to say they were still alive. The smiles make the photo feel light, but each phone call carried days of fear, silence, and uncertainty back home. In 1940, Soviet officials in Przemysl handed over oil tank cars to German border officials under the Soviet-German trade agreements. The image is unsettling because materials sent east to west later helped fuel the same war machine that turned against the Soviet Union. In 1918, a German Halberstadt CL-2 was loaded with small aerial bombs before a ground support mission. The aircraft became known for flying low over infantry lines, showing how air warfare was changing from scouting to direct battlefield support. In 1941, German soldiers in Antwerp posed in improvised costumes before Walpurgis Night, wearing scarves, aprons, and work clothes for the camera. The strange group portrait shows how occupation life could produce surreal moments that looked almost like theater inside a city at war. In early June 1945, Soviet soldiers examined handcuffs inside a Gestapo prison building in Berlin after the city had fallen. The table of restraints turned the defeated headquarters into evidence of how closely fear and paperwork had worked together. In the 1960s, a United States engineer shook hands with a test dummy used for spacesuit experiments. The strange figure helped researchers study pressure suits, movement, and safety before real astronauts trusted similar systems in space. In 1907, a sumo wrestler in Imperial Japan posed in a training stable, seated with the heavy ritual cords of his profession hanging from his belt. The image shows sumo before modern stadium fame, when wrestlers lived under strict stable rules and carried centuries of ceremony into daily training. In November 1944, Budapest's Margaret Bridge broke apart when German demolition charges went off too early during the retreat. Cars, a tram, civilians, and soldiers were on the span, turning one Danube crossing into one of the city's darkest wartime scenes. In the 1940s, a United States beauty device sealed a woman's head in a clear chamber and lowered the air pressure around her face. The goal was a temporary rosy complexion, showing how far beauty salons would go for a fashionable look. In 1988, this Soviet Mi-24 helicopter lies wrecked in Afghanistan after being brought down by a United States-made Stinger missile. The Stinger changed the war by stripping away one of the Soviet Army's biggest advantages, because even low-flying gunships were no longer safe. In June 1952, Alberto Granado and Ernesto Guevara stood on the Mambo Tango raft at San Pablo in the Peruvian Amazon. They had helped at a nearby medical colony, and the handmade raft became one of the most famous symbols of their Latin American journey. On January 3, 1945, paratrooper Donald Hubler of Easy Company lost his life in an accident near Bastogne at only 22 years old. He had already survived Normandy and Operation Market Garden, making this simple uniform portrait a quiet record of a very short and intense wartime life. В сентябре 1940 года во время итальянского авианалета на Хайфу, находившуюся в подмандатной Палестине, были разрушены мусульманское кладбище и мечеть Истикляль. Этот снимок показывает, как война в Средиземноморье затрагивала не только порт и военные цели, но и святыни с гражданскими кварталами города. In 1994, the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires was destroyed in an attack that became Argentina's worst modern act of political violence. The ruins left 85 people lost and hundreds injured, turning one city block into a national wound that remains unresolved. Between 1942 and 1943, members of the French resistance group Francs Tireurs et Partisans prepared armed actions against German occupation forces. Their work was hidden, dangerous, and controversial, but it became part of the underground pressure that helped weaken control before liberation. This is not a French resistance scene. It shows a busy immigrant street outside Jewish grocery shops in New York in the early 20th century. The Yiddish lettering, food sacks, and children at the storefront captured daily life in a neighborhood built by new arrivals trying to survive and work. In 1919, Egyptian women marched publicly against British rule and made the revolution impossible to ignore. Their protests helped turn the uprising into a nationwide movement and showed that women were not just part of the struggle, but visible leaders in it. In 1959, contestants knelt on a London sidewalk and pushed peas forward with their noses in one of the strangest street competitions ever photographed. The rules were simple, but the scene looked absurdly serious, turning a tiny pea into the center of a full public race. In the early 20th century, this automatic milk lock let deliverymen place bottles inside a door compartment without entering the home. It promised cleaner milk and safer delivery, turning a simple front door into a tiny home technology system. This staged aquarium photo shows a man wearing a round underwater mask while a striped fish swims directly in front of his face. The close angle makes the fish look trapped inside the helmet, turning a simple underwater scene into a strange optical trick. In this vintage endurance contest, women sat high above the floor while a man below handed up food and drinks with a long pole. The scene looks comic, but these strange public challenges were serious crowd magnets, built to test patience as much as courage. In January 1955, this wedding photo shows a smiling young couple cutting a cake, long before the groom became linked to one of America's darkest legal cases. The ordinary pose makes the image unsettling because nothing in the room hints at the name that would later become infamous. On April 7, 1926, lightning struck the San Luis Obispo oil tank farm and sent a huge black cloud over the California coast. The fire destroyed major storage tanks and caused about $10 million in damage, making one weather strike look like an industrial disaster. This abandoned Soviet hotel in Pripyat still carries a faded emblem from a city once built as a model of modern life. After the Chernobyl evacuation in 1986, the rooftop sign became a silent marker of a place frozen almost overnight. Write in the comments which photo you like the most and for what reason.